Greetings everybody and welcome to Macro Talk 2. It is Thursday, January the 15th, the Ides of January 2026. And today we are talking about the specimen side, the other side of our macro rig. You're probably wondering what this is. You'll find out soon enough. The specimen rig is what I'm defining as anything beyond the camera and lens. And certainly at lower magnification and when we're early in macro, most of our concerns are on the camera side, the first side. That's where most of our attention is turned. That's where the focus stacking goes on. But there are a lot of considerations that need to be thought about when we're setting up the specimen side on the other side of the camera. Now, we talked on Tuesday about the basics of the specimen side. We talked about why it's important and why it even matters in macro. We talked about the various different degrees of freedom that you can get with a rig. We talked about the commonly used setups where we have various different kinds of motion stages. I'll show you what I mean. Something like something like this, where we have rotation stages and XY positioners, Z positioners, and we can move our subject in space using these. Why this is important, that it is stable, and the degrees of freedom that we can get with different kinds of arrangement. And today we're going to be talking about much more advanced stuff than that. We're going to be getting into the nitty-gritty of why and when we would use more specialized equipment than this. But to understand that completely, there are a couple of concepts, one of which I think I probably may have misled some people on Tuesday, and I'm going to cover that in the context of what we're talking about today. It's the goniometer thing. I mentioned to you erroneously that on my rig here that we have two goniometers, these top two pieces that I'm going to hopefully show you in a bit more clarity here. These top two elements that provide pitch and yaw are the movements, where they move like so, creating a pivot around a particular point in space called the nodal point. And I mentioned that these were the same units that were just positioned orthogonally at right angles to one another, but in fact they're not. These devices are sold in pairs, matched pairs, where the actual nodal point is the same for both of these pieces, because this has a much larger radius than this one, so that we can move our subject around in space. I beg your pardon. We can move our subject around in terms of its pitch and yaw, its position, without moving it in space. And this is going to be important today when we talk about some of the other more complicated arrangements that you might be using yourself or seeing described. And I'm going to show you exactly why all this is important with a little model I set up. But we'll get to that in just a moment. So the degrees of freedom are important, and it's important we understand what they do. And we talked about cantilevering, the whole idea of suspended weights at a distance from the center of gravity, and how that is a setup for vibration. And that is going to come back today and haunt us when we start talking about the various different ways that we can present a specimen in a vertical rig. We talked about compound platforms like this and stacked systems, which is basically what we have here, and the various risks that come with using them. And we briefly touched on automation. Now, I was going to show you my automated XYZR positioner today, but I'm not going to have time. I probably will leave that for a separate discussion, seeing as it really is. It's a much more complicated piece of equipment. So why does the advanced concept change everything when we're talking about positioning the specimen? It's because in beginner macro, like I suggested, most of our effort is concentrated on the camera side, learning how to use that. But as we get into higher and higher magnification, especially up into the 10x and 20x and beyond, we're much more focused and interested in what's going on the specimen side, because the specimen really becomes the reference frame for everything that we're doing. And motion on this side, motion on the side of the specimen, has to be predictable, and it has to be repeatable, it has to be reversible, and it has to be, in some cases, programmable, even when we're using positioning systems. So we're no longer just positioning a subject at high magnification. At high magnification, we're managing a whole coordinate system to get the right part of our subject in the right position for the photography that we want to do. It's considerably more complicated. Now, the first thing that will differ from what we discussed on Tuesday, where we were talking about a horizontal axis system, the camera positioned horizontally, and our positioning of the subject all going on in the vertical orientation. In other words, our subject's on top of a platform that has various degrees of freedom of motion, like the platform that I showed you just a minute ago, this one. Everything is stacked up over the center of gravity, and our subject is at the very top. Now, in case you're wondering, this thing at the top of this rig, this little platform, was something I just threw together this morning, designed this morning and printed it. It actually places this ball at the end of the pin at the nodal point, meaning I can move the goniometers on this rig, and the center of mass of this pin does not move. It stays in the same position no matter what I do with the two axes of the goniometers. That is important to know, and you'll see why in just a little bit. But this is on a vertical system where our center of mass stays very central. Most of our problems related to vibration are on the other side, on the camera side. But that is going to change when we switch to a vertical rig. By vertical rig, I mean we position the camera, the tubes, the relay lenses, the objectives vertically on preferably on a very stiff, secure platform, so that the camera is actually moving up and down to do our focusing. The rail is positioned vertically. If that's the case, then our subject needs to be underneath the camera. Now, there are two schools of thought on this basic vertical rig, one of which changes the whole idea of a positioning platform, and that is probably the simpler of the methods, where we create a new method, a platform that basically moves left and right, forwards and backwards, and maybe around in a circle. All of those movements can be done in a very compressed, very low system that is not particularly vibration prone, but it creates all kinds of problems because we're no longer able to, for example, use goniometers. We're no longer able to get the high degrees of motion that we're used to when we're using a horizontal rig. So that is one way, and it is a very quick way to get a very stable system. You basically move all of the concern over vibration to the camera itself and how you mount it on a vertical support. However, there is another way that this can be approached, and this is a way, if you've ever seen Mr. Rick Littlefield's setup, you know that this is the way he approaches it. He takes his full stack of positioning hardware and positions it horizontally on a very sturdy mount that he has created. So the camera now is upright, and the multi-stage positioning system, the XY platform, the rotation platform, the goniometers are all horizontal, attached at the base. you can immediately see where this might cause a problem. We've talked about this before. The longer the extension of heavy equipment away from the center of gravity or the point of attachment, the more of a cantilever you have, and the more risk there is of getting vibration in that part of the system. Now, Rick's system is extraordinarily robust, very, very firmly held at the base, and he assures me it's not a vibration prone system. He's more concerned about the camera being extended from the vertical post as being a potential issue. So that is a very different mindset. If you are going to use a system like that, you have to have good reason. And there is good reason to use the multiple degrees of freedom, horizontal orientation. And that is if you need those degrees of freedom for positioning your subject. For example, if you're photographing difficult things like insects, that flat platform, the easy platform directly under the camera, does not give you enough freedom to be able to position an insect in an optimal way. Excuse me, I'm having trouble with words today. And that really makes a difference. If you're prepared to take the risk that comes with using a heavy horizontal positioning system, then be sure that you need to be doing so. And in the case of Rick's setup, where he's frequently photographing very specific structures at very specific angles, where it is crucial that he be able to move tiny subjects in a particular orientation to find the structures he's looking for, he simply has to take the risk of using this heavier horizontal system. So you can go either way. The truth of the matter is the perfect system would have both. It would have both a stable horizontal platform with just the left, right, forward, backward, and rotational elements, and then it would be configurable with all of the different elements of motion that you might need for a more complicated subject. But why vertical works and why it's something that people often will go to first for their macro system is you've got gravity working with you, and you don't have nearly as much cantilevering. You have predictable load paths and no droop of the system. So the geometry of lighting also gets a little bit simpler when you have this simple vertical system. Now, specimen stability significantly improves with the simple system, obviously, because it's sitting there under gravity on a flat surface, and it does require that you have a subject that would lend itself to this. Think of coins or other flat stamps, for example, something that you want to hold flat. Use gravity and use the simpler system, because that would serve you well. But for the mechanism itself, when you have this simple horizontal system, there is very little need to have a lot of time for settling after movement, because it's just not a vibration prone system. So making movements before allowing the rail to move is something you can do much faster. You can stack faster with the simple rig, but it's always a trade-off. You get less precision, less freedom, and more stability. Now, what are the kinds of things that we would want to use a more advanced rig for? Well, sometimes it is necessary, for example, to move the subject instead of the camera, and for precision focus stacking with the specimen side moving. That obviously takes a much more complicated setup to allow the Z motion in the platform itself. I'm not going to talk about that right now because it is essentially the same as the system that you use to move your camera. It just does come with some additional problems because of the weight and the center of gravity of the positioning table. We'll come back around to it if we have time at the end. But most of the concern is going to be with special use cases like stacking and stitching, for example. This is a process whereby you shoot a stack and then you move the subject into a different position, or you move the camera into a different position to shoot another stack, and you keep doing that until you've covered the whole subject. In doing something like that, you not only have to control the z-axis, that's the camera axis, the stacking part, but also the XY axis, which we call the tiling part. And we have to keep angular alignment consistent, meaning we can't allow the subject to turn as it's being moved. So on the specimen side, for stacking and stitching, we have to have a true orthogonal axis. The XY axis has to be truly at 90 degrees to the camera's optical axis. Otherwise, when we move the subject, we are going to essentially change the angle. On the platforms that you use for stacking and stitching, they generally need to be a bit bigger with increased mass because of all of the moving parts, and because you have longer lever arms, more cantilevering, you need to have stiffer and more robust supports for systems that you're using for stacking and stitching. You really can't just move the platform a little bit left and right. You have to have a system that is solidly grounded to make these movements. In other words, if your specimen mount is barely adequate for stacking, then stitching is going to be just about impossible. You need a very robust system for that, and certainly I would favor a vertical orientation of the platform, of the motion platform, for stacking and stitching. Excuse me, my nose is running. This has been going on all day. So another reason we need a more complex, a more involved system on the specimen side is if we want to do anything that is time-based. For example, motion capture, or if we're shooting sequences of action in our subject, and this introduces the whole concept of dynamics. We now have new constraints when we're using the system to capture motion. We have the constraints of the motion itself. Time is now a variable. How long we have to wait between parts of the motion, and the specimen must be able to return predictably to a known state, a known position. This is all basic to anybody who's done any motion capture, but a little bit bewildering, I think, to people who are unfamiliar with it. But an example would be if you were trying to record video or still sequences of a subject moving, say an insect eating or a plant growing. There are a lot of different ways it can be used, but repeatability is probably the most important. So a very robust and stable system is very much needed. Automation can become pretty necessary at very high magnifications because we are inconsistent ourselves when we're trying to do moving manually. We get tired, we get bored, we get distracted when we're trying to repeatedly make movements with the system. So for certain particular workflows, the automation becomes almost necessary. Well, it does become necessary. Just like with focus stacking, you can do it manually up to a point, but then you need something more. So for specimen side automation, there are motorized linear stages. My system, my motorized system, consists of multiple small linear stages that work in concert. You can also have motorized goniometers, and you can use software to come up with all kinds of scripted motion sequences for all of these parts, so they're all moving together. But again, to do so, I again would favor a horizontal camera situation with a vertical platform, specimen platform. Automation doesn't fix a bad setup. If you have a setup that is prone to vibration, it's going to be prone to vibration when you automate it too. So don't think of automation as a cure-all for lazy design or bad construction. In fact, whatever you build is going to get amplified with automation, and that's worth bearing in mind. A motor will do exactly what you tell it to do, even when it's the wrong thing. So setting up these platforms for motion is complicated, and it's fairly sophisticated. Uh, Something that hopefully we'll get to talk about in more detail later. Um, One of the things that we see with more complicated platforms is that we have error that can accumulate within the system. And the idea is that every added axis of motion that you use in a positioning system is going to multiply the risk of alignment problems. If you have 5 degrees of freedom, then you can become misaligned 5 times easier because you've got the different axes. And of course, it becomes more and more complex to determine exactly where your subject position is. And advanced rails or advanced rigs, I should say, like this multi-axis one of mine, uh, will have a tendency to create additive problems as you get more into to demanding shooting sequences. So the best bet is to use as few axes as you can get away with. If you don't need the goniometers, for example, don't use them. It's much better to have a purpose-built rig for what you're doing and add elements that you need when you need them, and take them away when you don't need them. A simple XY platform, left, right, or forward, backward, is probably fairly safe to add. It doesn't generally cause a lot of issues, but something like a goniometer can cause a lot of issues. If you don't need it, don't use it. So there are things to think about when you're designing advanced specimen rigs like this. And probably the most important is to keep the specimen as close to the core of the structure as possible. You always want to avoid long extensions away from the center of mass. You don't want to have your specimen dangling out in space if you can help it. You want it to be positioned over the mass. So you want as little mass as possible outside of the center of mass of your rig. So don't design one where you have to have arms coming in from the side holding your specimen. It's always better to have a system that's gravity loaded than spring loaded, for example, so that gravity is working with you and not against you. Always design for any settling time that needs to be brought into the mix. For example, if you were using a system like this in horizontal position, so our camera is vertical. If we were to position this and mount it in such a way that it would be held like so, then we would need to take into account the motion of this platform in, say, the Z direction, would require settling time after each movement before your photograph would be safe to take. So plan on that. And you know, if you have any question, actually measure what is going on in your system. Actually measure the vibration if you're suspicious that is part of the problem. So let's talk now about the very specific use cases that would demand having a different setup or a modified setup than the basic. I'll tell you what though, before we do that, let me briefly do what I was going to do with the goniometer demonstration that I've got set up, mainly because I just went to the trouble of setting it up, so I ought to show it to you. What I wanted to demonstrate was the importance of having a matched pair of goniometers. You don't go into the goniometer shop and say, yeah, let me have two of these goniometer units, the top one, because if you did so, then what would happen would be when you adjusted. You know what the goniometer does. The goniometer is a single axis where the table moves along the arc of a circle. So let me see if I can get my hand out of the way to show you. Actually, the other camera will probably be a little bit better. Yeah. So with this top unit, when I turn the handle, the top part of the platform slides around an arc which is part of a circle, part of a much larger circle. And in doing so, it causes what's called either pitch or yaw, depending on the perspective you're looking at it from. We'll say that this is side to side. So this would actually be one axis of motion where the subject would tip, and you can see the little ball is now angled. It'll tip, but it'll stay in exactly the same position. It is true also of the other axis, which is at 90 degrees to this axis. I'll put that one back on 0. Now when I turn the other one, it is now doing what we call a pitch change, in that the ball is staying in the same position, but the platform is tilting towards you. So I will do that a little bit more so you can see it. But again, the ball is staying in the same position. Now, it couldn't do that if both of these platforms were the same. That's my point. This platform, in fact, has a considerably larger radius. In fact, the difference in radius is the difference in the height of these two blocks. Let me turn it so that you can see the scale on this side. So even though the ball is changing its orientation, it's not changing its position, which means it will be right in the middle of our frame for both shots. And the way we do this is by buying our goniometers in what's called a matched pair. The piece on the bottom has a radius actually of about 80 millimeters, whereas the one on the top has a radius of only 60 millimeters. So that no matter which of these adjustments you make, now I'm going to do both of them maximally. So now I have the one axis as far as I can get it to go in one direction, the other one as far as I can get it to go in the forward and backward direction, yet the ball has still not moved position. It's in exactly the same position, only it's now tilted so that we can see a different part of it. So what I said on Tuesday that was wrong was that these two units were the same. They are not. They're a matched pair with the larger radius goniometer on the bottom, and the smaller radius goniometer on top. And that allows you to have a single modal point around which the thing can be repositioned. All right, so that's that cleared up. Now let's talk about various specimen side modifications that you would need to think about if you were going to be designing a rig for certain activities. Let's talk first about liquid medium, because that's probably the most obvious one. It would be rather hard to have a very useful horizontal system when you had a liquid medium, because of course when you put the little dish of liquid up to photograph it, it would all run out, right? It's physics. You knew that part. So when we're photographing specimens in a liquid medium, we need to think about a lot of different things in how we're going to have our specimen side of the rig set up. This will be the case if we had live specimens or preserved specimens, if we were doing different types of optical manipulation or refractive matching. All of these things would involve having a subject in liquid. The specimen when it's in liquid is now buoyant and mobile. Most of our specimens stay pretty still when they're just being acted on by gravity in the air on the end of a pin. But when we have something floating around in a liquid medium, it can move, it can float, and in some ways it's optically dependent or coupled to the container it's in. Take a petri dish. Well, don't take it. I mean, you can look at it, but don't take it. A petri dish like this, there's no way that you can photograph something in a petri dish without encountering some of the petri dish itself, and that can be optically relevant, and we have to plan our platform around that. So gravity no longer really defines orientation like it does outside of liquid. In liquid, things can kind of rotate around and develop a completely different orientation by virtue of the fact that they're floating. Even surface tension at high magnification, if you've ever used a stereoscope to try to catch something on the end of a pin, you'll realize that surface tension becomes a real mechanical force you have to deal with, because it will move things and change their orientation. So what are the things that we can do to make the specimen side more manageable when we're dealing with liquids? One thing is to have very shallow fluid chambers or fluid cells. You've seen these slides with a small indentation in them. That would be a shallow fluid cell. It has minimal fluid depth, so the subject can't wander in and out of focus too much. And you can also put flat optical windows on top of it, like a cover slip that will seal or at least partially seal the liquid. The goals of having a system for photographing in a liquid need to include limiting or minimizing convection. You know, convection, the force that causes molecules in a liquid to move in a predictable way. It's usually a result of heat. So having a system that's not overly warm from your lighting would be important. You want to minimize refractive gradients, so you don't want to be dealing with light that's getting radically bent as it goes into the medium through the container, and you want to have a system that minimizes or controls the specimen's drift within the medium itself. We talk about this a lot with pond scum type of photography, where we're imaging things that swim around a lot, and there are ways that we can control that movement by thickening the liquid. Decoupling the container is something that you basically make the container not an element in the photograph by having a way to hold the specimen within the fluid. so that it kind of fixes it almost like it was in the air, using very fine pins or meshes, micro meshes, and clamping structures. But it's an important way to get control of the subject's movement. So if you think about it this way, when you're photographing something in liquid, you are really photographing the container more than you are the subject. That's what you really need to think about. You're mounting and positioning the container that has the subject in it, rather than mounting and positioning the subject itself. A couple of benefits of liquids. You might not know this, but liquid provides one of the best vibration damping systems there is. So your settling times are greatly reduced when the subject's in liquid, and you have considerably less vibration, which is kind of counterintuitive, but good to know. So you get those advantages, those benefits of less vibration and quicker settling times, but you get them at the cost of a lot of optical complexity that you don't have when you're shooting in air, and some real lighting challenges. And yeah, that's a problem. Thermal gradients I talked about, there it's a risk to be aware of. The lights that get hot, that type of thing. Even evaporation will change the nature of the liquid you're shooting through. So for very specific cases where you have high magnification, you really want to try to control evaporation as well, because the refractive index will shift as the liquid evaporates and becomes more concentrated. Even the simple meniscus at the edge of a body of fluid where it's held by the container can grossly distort the optics and create all kinds of distortion. So be aware of that. All right, so another special consideration where a different rig a design needs to be thought about is when you're wanting to use at least some element of backlighting or transillumination. You can't, for example, use the simple platform I described at the beginning, the flat platform underneath the camera that doesn't have the different degrees of freedom, because there's nowhere underneath. You're on the table already. You've got a very flat system, and backlighting requires now that the specimen stage be up off the base layer, and because basically your light source is occupying some of the specimen space, or the potential specimen space. So the platform now has to allow light to pass, so it can't be a solid a piece of metal or wood. It has to allow diffusion of the light, and it has to be aligned with the rest of the system. So probably the easiest thing to do is to use the same basic system but use an elevated specimen bridge. In some ways, that's what this thing that I have on top of these goniometers could be considered as like a specimen bridge that lifts it up off the table. Your degrees of freedom don't change, but you can now position lights down below the subject or even behind the subject completely. So you've got to think about that. Another thing you can do is just use transparent supports instead of using wood or metal. You can just use something transparent, but bear in mind that transparent support is probably also going to bend your light and create new problems. Fine wire frames are sometimes used to elevate the specimen up off the base. But the key is you have to keep the optical path clear. You can't have anything in the way of the light. Integrated light devices or light wells. I think this is one of the ways that Bud has controlled this in his vertical rig, is by recessing LED light below the actual layer of the surface layer of the specimen holder. So having lights and diffusers below the level of the subject is doable. It makes the whole rig more complicated, though, and that's really important. The trade-offs of vertical clearance, you have to increase the working distance. You must, otherwise you're not going to be able to focus. And reducing the numeric aperture and increasing the depth of field can be beneficial, and they can also be limiting depending on what you're using the rig for. So backlighting and other forms of advanced lighting are difficult to do unless you're going to use a more capable rig that gives you more ability to make these changes in subject position. Transillumination itself and using the excuse me, my phone is going off, but I can't find it because it's hidden behind this screen. So hopefully it's not because my audio has gone off or anything awful like that. I'll check it again in a minute. So if you're using a hybrid system of epi-illumination or transillumination, where you're trying to shoot surface detail from the top, and you have lighting from the top, as well as internal structures using lighting from below, then you obviously need a rig that is going to allow access for lighting from both sides, and you need to be able to control the lighting geometry independently for the top and for the bottom, and you need to have optical isolation for both light systems. How are you going to do that? Well, it becomes really pretty complicated, and you have to use a system of blackened baffles and light traps to prevent light from the epi system encroaching on the lighting from behind. So the whole rig has to be designed around that, and it can get really complicated, where you're having to control light in ways that you haven't done before, and you won't be able to do that with a simple system. Some rigs are used with for optical matching and refractive index work, like crystals, gels, and biological sections, where you want minimum surface glare, but you want to emphasize the internal structure of your specimen, where you have controlled scattering of light. So the choice becomes how you're going to design the optics, and then the specimen side needs to revolve around that. You also have to think about the containers, the material you're using, glass or plastic, and thickness uniformity becomes really important at higher magnification. You might not be aware of this, but they sell different grades of cover slips for microscope slides. Some of them mean the nominal thickness of the cover slip is close to what it says it is, and others mean it's nowhere near what it says it is. Apparently, they can sell cover slips that are supposed to be 0.17 or 0.017, no, 0.17 millimeters thick, and depending on the grade of the cover slip, it can be twice that. Again, I learned this from Bud, who's having to measure all of his cover slips to make sure that he has uniform thickness of all of the glass components, because he's at such high magnification and such high resolution. So just be aware that the containers that you're putting your material in can introduce all kinds of aberrations themselves. Photographing living specimens is another situation that requires a completely different thinking of how you're gonna mount the specimens. It has to, for example, have a temperature stability. If you have a live specimen, it's not going to do well if it gets out of its comfort zone. You need to be able to control humidity, especially with plant materials, for example. And you have to be able to constrain the movement of a living subject without hurting it. So these are all important. If your system doesn't have a method by which it can keep the specimen the same temperature, the same humidity, and not moving, then your subject side positioner is not going to be very helpful with live subjects. These can include environmental enclosures. You've seen me do photography inside these small terraria. That would be one example of an environmental enclosure on the specimen side. Soft mounting systems and different access ports for getting to the subject. But you really need to. I would say most of these really advanced systems for example, shooting live subjects, requires a very specific custom built platform depending on your use case. There is no one size fits all. It would be nice to think that a rig like I have here, as capable and as handy as it is not going to be acceptable for all of the things that I would want to mount on the other side from the camera. But it is a good place to start. There is no one size fits all when it comes to positioning. Now, some specimens, they're not alive, but they are exquisitely fragile, or maybe they're electrostatic, and all of this creates problems with static charge or damage from handling and air movement around the subject. So if you're going to be photographing things like by extremely fragile or electrostatic, I'm talking about feathers, down, spores, fine powders, microfibers. All of those things will move as soon as your hand gets near them because of the static charge you have. When you breathe near them, they move. So if you're going to be photographing things like that, you need to adapt your design by enclosing the area that the specimen's going to be in, either just right around it or enclosing the whole platform. And you need to probably consider grounding the mounting system so that it doesn't become an electrical liability for static discharge. And you want to have lighting that doesn't itself move the air. So that would be, for example, LED panels that have built-in fans. They stir up the air around the specimen. For these particular use cases of very, very delicate, very fine subjects, you can't have fans running in LEDs. It'll blow your subject right off the mount. So at this scale, like with the liquids, air is a physical force that you need to think about, and you need to keep your specimen protected from. There are some subjects or specimens that require absolute control over their orientation. In other words, not just the relative control. When I say I like the look of this bee when it's tilted towards me more than when it's tilted to the right, that is a relative control of the orientation. I mean, I know where it is and I know where I want it, so I can move it in that direction. Absolute orientation control means I need to know that that computer chip is at 90 degrees to the sensor. Or I need to know that crystal face is 45 degrees from the base of the mount. So if you're doing crystallography, photographing crystals, or if you're photographing anisotropic materials, or if you birefringence, something that we do, sometimes you absolutely need to have a known angular reference. You need to know that this is 90 degrees, this is 45 degrees. And you need to have repeatable rotational alignment. It's not just enough to be able to move something round in a circle. You also want to know that you've moved it 90 degrees round in a circle, and when you stop, it'll always be at the same position when your marker says it is. So this is absolute control, and it's something that if you're using polarized light, you'll frequently need to be able to control uh, the motion accurately and absolutely. In order to set up a system that allows for proper absolute orientation control, you really need elements like this. The well, you can't really see it from up there, can you? Where you have these numeric. I don't think you can see that. Let me see if there's a way I can light it a little bit better. Probably not. I had a devil of a time doing this. Maybe you can see right on that rotational element, for example. If we turn it just a little bit, you can see that there are very accurate grid here, a very accurate scale, so that we can get an absolute movement of 10 degrees, and we can lock the motion in at 10 degrees and know that when we move back to 0, we've moved back through the same 10 degrees. This is important. On a rig like this, all of the axes have a scale in order to ensure that we have fairly good absolute control over the orientation. And yeah, having indents is helpful too. Some of the scales will have little indentations so that you can feel a physical click when something locks into place at a given angle. That helps too. And having orientation markings mounted on as many of the axes as possible is a necessity to doing that. So every one of these special configurations that I've talked about require a slightly different take on the platform, the specimen side platform, and they're all pretty specialized, and you need to know a lot about the various risks and benefits of the different axes of motion, and the different mounting styles and the different orientation of the device. You need to understand all that stuff to make the right decisions about what is best for your particular use case. But every one of the things I've just described, every one of the weird little modifications you might want to make to your specimen side, only exists because the specimen demands it. They're not things that we just dreamt up to be more complicated. These are the considerations you have to make if you're going to have a system that's going to allow you to image what you're trying to photograph. So it's actually a pretty good sign when your rig starts looking really strange. That's a sign you're probably doing the right thing. You've got it figured out. If you've got a lot of complicating little structures that you've had to add onto your rig. So the basic rig is a wonderful place to start, and then the more advanced and complex your photography becomes, the more advanced and complex your specimen side becomes, because it has to. There's only so much that you can do from the camera side when you're talking about these special cases. Now, this was, I know, a lot of information and a lot of complicated gobbledygook. I'm sure for some of you, but trust me that if you stick around in macro long enough, you'll encounter these problems, and you'll need to work out ways to solve them. So that is all I have on the whole idea of the subject side, and what we can do to make sure we're set up correctly to do the kind of photography that we want. Um, whether whether you're brand new to macro or have been doing it for a long time, I would always encourage you to come up with a system that makes sense for the kind of photography that you want to do. If you are predominantly photographing things that live in the water, for example, don't build a horizontal rig and try to come up with a way to modify it to photograph vertical water. Instead, from the start, build the system that you need. And probably most of us, certainly if you stick around long enough, it will cover almost all of us. Having a rig that you can convert from, say, the vertical to horizontal, allowing you to at least have access to all of these special considerations we've been talking about is a really good idea. I very much like the rig that Rick uses because basically it consists of a platform, a subject stage, and a camera uh, setup that will literally rotate through 90 degrees to give the orthogonal positioning so that you can immediately go into a horizontal mode and shoot that way. So the camera and the specimen stage literally are swapped, so that you take the specimen stage to vertical, the camera to horizontal, and you've changed your system. Building something like that, it's a little bit more complex. You need to plan it carefully and come up with the right materials to support the weight and everything. But it's all doable. You can actually look at our at my web app. There are multiple rigs that people have come up with, and each of them, you'll notice, has a slightly different specimen side. And looking through those will give you some ideas about what your options and alternatives are. But basically, something that's rigid, something that doesn't have big overhangs, something that isn't heavily cantilevered, in other words, something that has accurate and positionable degrees of freedom that give you enough degrees of freedom to do the things that you want to do. That's the basic principle that you need to work by. Generally speaking, we have a tendency to over or under engineer different parts of our system. But by paying close attention to what you're building and why, you can avoid most of those problems. This is as important as anything you do on the camera side. This is as important as eliminating vibration from the rail is eliminating vibration from the specimen side. Trust me on that. And the higher the magnification, the more important it becomes. Let me see who is with us today while I still have a few minutes. Ingolf is here from Germany. And we have Janksi from, I hope I pronounced that correctly. I do forget how to pronounce names, from Transylvania. Tony from Florida. Dimitri from Athens. David from Maine. And Roy from Worcestershire, where it's apparently wet and cold and miserable. Wonderful to see everybody. Who else is here? John is here. John Crooks, up in Massachusetts. I love that state. What a great place. And Bud is here. Bud, you should have chimed in and corrected all the things I said wrong about your rig. Ingolf, Emily. Greetings, Emily. Long time no see. Robert Ocala. Is it also wet and cold in your part of Florida, Robert? Oh, no, 20 degrees. That's freezing for there. Nick is here. Greetings, Nick. Julie, glad you made it. And Harold, everybody is here. Boy, the whole crowd came today. Fantastic. How difficult is it to change from horizontal to vertical platforms with one system? Not really. And removing the goniometers is a piece of cake. It just takes a few seconds. And in fact, Rick does not remove the goniometers in his horizontal rig. Actually, David, I'll talk to you about this because there are a lot of things to consider if you're going to use the same platform in horizontal. It's all about the bracing that you have. Alan has had 12 hours without power. I'm glad you got power and you're back with us. That sounds horrible. Zeno, greetings, and let me see. Klaus is here. Greetings, Klaus. Great to see you last night. Enjoyed your pictures. My camera club met. It's not mine. The camera club I belong to met last night, and we had a wonderful meeting and some spectacular photographs. Well, I'm going to go blow my nose. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, so it's time for us to pack it in. The only announcement I have is per Zoom on Saturday, 10 o'clock in the morning. Until noon o'clock in the morning. So yeah, 2 hours of per Zoom on Saturday, and got a couple of special things to talk about. Otherwise, it's going to be the usual structure and format. Competition is going on. I'm still looking for a volunteer as a guest judge for the competition this month. If anybody is interested in being a guest judge with me and being in a video and talking about other people's photographs, get in touch with me ASAP and let me know. All right, guys, have a great weekend. Stay out of trouble. Stay warm and dry, depending on where you are. And I will see you on Saturday or next week. Take care and be well.